privilege. Thus, is it any wonder that so many think that the story of resurrection continues to represent nonsense as they watch it in practice? Just this week, one can point to the headlines. First, about the Vatican and its response or lack of it to the accusations concerning the abuse of children by the leadership of this most small c Catholic of traditions. Or we can point to the headlines about the Hutterite Christian militia in the Midwest who thought it might be in the service of God to kill as many police officers as possible. Goodness. But let's admit it, we can look much closer to home and admit that we have known a form of nonsense even here at Casas, Adobes, UCC. For we continue now 2 Christmases and 2 Easters later to try to find a context in which to make any sense that one of our own pastors might have chosen to end his own life rather than to wait and to watch and to wonder what new thing might the Spirit of God have been calling him to discover and to share. David Lose has written, all 4 evangelists record the doubt, wonder, and fear of the disciples. But Luke is, perhaps, the most honest. When the women return with the news, it's not just the disciples aren't sure. They regard what they hear as an idle tale. And Lose continues, actually the word Luke uses, leros, is a little saltier. It was used to describe something utterly unbelievable, even a little mad. If we were to be a bit more colloquial, but perhaps more faithful to the earthy speech of fishermen, we might describe leros as the stuff farmers use to fertilize their fields. That's right, leros says. The first disciples thought the Easter proclamation was, and then Los spells out what can't quite be pronounced and best not be voiced from the pulpit. What Los does put in print is B, asterisk, ampersand, L, S, H, $, pound mark. Nonsense indeed. Recently I heard a story about a bagpiper who had been engaged by a funeral director in rural Kentucky to come and play at the pauper's service for this homeless and friendless man without a family. And this bagpiper didn't know his way in the backcountry very well and got lost in the woods. Indeed, he was really quite distraught to realize that as the appointed time came and passed some more, that he had failed his assignment. But then an hour later, he sees the backhoe and the work crew, no longer a hearse visible around the hole. And he parks his car and he gets his bagpipes out and he walks over to the hole. The crew is eating their lunch off to the side. And he mumbles an apology, but as he looks in the hole, he sees that the vault lid has already been placed. And he decides to play his bagpipes anyway. And he plays them. His heart is full of care and compassion for this lost soul who had no one to attend his funeral. He plays, and he's playing Amazing Grace. He starts to weep, but the workmen get up from their lunch and stand next to him, and they start to weep, and together they're all crying as the echo of the bagpipe ends and wafts across the Kentucky backcountry. The bagpiper, with his head hung low, but his heart yet full, returns to his car and puts the bagpipes away. And as he starts to get into his own car, he hears one of the workmen say, "Oh, I've never been so moved Sweet Mother of Jesus, I've been doing this for 20 years, installing septic tanks. But Professor Los urges us to understand that this story might well represent the nonsense that the first male disciples assumed when the first female disciples returned from the garden with news of the empty tomb. And the septic tank is likely, possibly, the right image for what these men were thinking about the women that day. But news of the empty tomb was only nonsense to those who had little faith in their master. It was only an idle tale to those who had even less respect for their sisters. It was only affluent waste to those whose wonder in the grace and love of God had been replaced by guilt and despair. So then, on this Easter Sunday, what is it we think and believe when we hear again the report of the women to us? How do we acknowledge that the world in which the Christian gospel is proclaimed is not nearly ready enough to put aside its fears and its selfish desires? How do we commit to live and act as a renewed and resurrected community of the risen Christ and dare to sing Alleluia without embarrassment and shame? And how do we move beyond the challenge for any and every Christian tradition that finds the biggest threat to the proclamation of its good news is too often its own practitioners, and especially